Welcome to The Pillars. Today we're talking about fasting. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss not just what fasting is, but how you can apply it to multiple areas of your life, not just when it comes to food. Things like social media, your electronics, and even some people who may not be necessarily beneficial for your life. So enjoy.
Welcome to The Pillars, the podcast of the 363rd ISR Wing of the United States Air Force. I'm Chaplain Jim.
I'm Dr. Jerry.
And I'm Sergeant Joe.
And on today's podcast, we're going to look at fasting because it's that season for a lot of folks where in their spiritual tradition, they're going to begin a season of fasting. But we know not all of you are going to be spiritual, so we're going to look at fasting from multiple angles.
Absolutely. And when we say fasting, I think a lot of people think the traditional or biblical fasting of giving up food for a certain period of time. But there's a lot of different ways that we can think about fasting in terms of what it is that we give up for a constrained period of time.
Definitely. When I think of fasting, I think of, what has taken up the most of your time. So, when you're looking at your life balance and you're looking at giving up some things to get additional time back, I look at electronic fasting, TV fasting, sometimes even friendship fasting.
And I think that doing it like that's key, like that's the what. The why really are these things do occupy your life. And sometimes it's a good period to evaluate where are you spending your time on? What are you putting in your body? And to go without for a bit of time. There was a famous philosopher, a Stoic philosopher named Seneca, and what he would do is a few times per year, he would put on these terrible clothes. They're uncomfortable. He would go without food. He would just have a little bit of water, and he would walk around looking like a beggar in the city where he was upper class and say, is this the condition I so feared? Is this the condition I so feared? Now, why would he do it? Well, he said it was training the mind for difficult situations in the future. Because if he could go through this short period of time where he could deal with people maybe making fun of him or not having food or being hungry, he could deal with it in the future. So fasting can prepare you for those difficult seasons of your life when you might have to go without social media, or you might have to go without friends, you might have to go without those things you desire, but you don't truly need.
That's really interesting that you put in that context, because what fasting essentially does is it cuts you off from something that is comforting or is pleasurable or makes you feel at the very least content in the moment. And when we do that and we're no longer able to access whatever that resource is, we experience a sense of physiological stress. I say it's interesting because I'm looking at the science of intermittent fasting. I'm looking at different peer-reviewed scientific journals in which they actually talk about the physiological impacts of going without food for a certain period of time. And at the molecular level, or at the cellular level rather, what this actually does is invokes a certain amount of stress on the cells themselves in the body. But what's cool about that, they use the stress term not as a denigrative term, but because it's actually good for the health of the cell. The cell actually has to reorganize its priorities, actually induces a process called autophagy, which means it basically consumes part of itself, usually the junk parts, the things that it wasn't using, that was just kind of holding on to, or takes up its reserve energy stores. It actually makes the cell function more efficiently overall.
That's interesting, because you definitely think when fasting, sometimes you're just focusing on the spiritual component, right? Like the why you're going without. But when you think of it as, in health terms, it's kind of interesting to realize there's health benefits.
Well, it sparks adaptation. So discomfort is a primary mechanism through which we learn and we actually better ourselves. If you're in a constant state of contentment, then you have no motivation or desire to do anything that might put stress or strain on you, or that would essentially better yourself. And learning and self-improvement has to, most of the time, come with some sense of discomfort. And that's because we give up that thing which is comfortable, which is essentially the status quo, and dedicate ourselves to other priorities. And when we do that, we have to learn how to adapt to the new stresses that entails.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about any kind of pursuit in your personal or professional life. If you want to achieve something, then that means you have to give up maybe something else that you like to do. I mean, simple example is when it comes to education. If you're going to pursue, online distance education or in-person brick and mortar education, that means you have to now allocate a certain amount of your time during the day, throughout the week, to that endeavor, which means you may have to give up spending time with friends or sleep or your exercise routine or some time that you might otherwise spend playing video games, things that are pleasurable, enjoyable. So it causes you to adapt, but that stress is ultimately beneficial in the long run.
Yeah, I don't for me personally, I don't do any type of food fasting for spiritual reasons or anything, but what I do is I fast from electronics, or sometimes we have bad peers, right? They're bad influences, right? And so sometimes you need to kind of fast those away, right? So you can get to the core. But what I kind of look at is when you do go through this fasting, there's going to be this like adjustment period like you were talking about. And I always think of it as when, I remember with my children, it's like when you take the pacifier away,
Right.
or when you take the blanket away, right? Whatever that comforting tool is, and you watch kind of the struggle. It's funny because when you take someone's cell phone away, you will see a lot of similarities between an adult and a 2-year-old, you know, as
Losing
far
the
as like, give me
pacifier.
my phone back.
Well,
Yeah.
it's true. For a few weeks, we put our phones upstairs for like 2 hours at a time, and now we're kind of omnipresent, my spouse and I, because of our jobs. So we put it upstairs on a weekend just to test it, like check every 2 hours, like go up, and you almost feel. I don't know the right term, probably cognitive dissonance, like just feeling antsy. You're like, oh my gosh, where's my phone? I should be checking my app or this game I play. Or
That's part of the Skinner box of our phones. I mean, we're so attuned to these notifications, and we get a certain like small hit of dopamine every time we get that little ding notification, or we see a number pop up on our screen. And so, like the prototypical Skinner box, we are now conditioned to want to check that and constantly recheck it, and it becomes stressful over time, which is why you'll see a lot of people recommend social media fasting, and you can take it a step further and go whole cell phone fasting, depending on your own personal situation. But the research I've seen on that is that people tend to feel less anxious, less stressed after that initial adjustment period. Of course, they adapt, and all of a sudden it's like their minds are now free, and they can focus more wholeheartedly on other things.
I'm always surprised with how much time I actually have back. Sometimes I'm actually bored, which is really crazy concept for how fast life can go.
Sure.
And so when you're sitting there and you're just like, wow, I don't have anything to do, it's interesting to try to create new opportunities for yourself instead of returning back to the phone, but doing something different.
Absolutely. And that goes right alongside with what we talked about in episode number 59 on instant gratification. A lot of times we check our phones just because we're bored, or we'll scroll endlessly through one of our news feeds on our social media apps just because it's something to do. But when you take that away, then all of a sudden you experience that sensation of boredom and have to find a constructive means to deal with that.
And one of our 5 Minutes to Thrive talked about how boredom can spark creativity.
Absolutely.
And so, but for food fasting, we do want to caveat that if you are interested in fasting, check with your healthcare provider. We're not giving you medical advice or any of those things, but I would suggest maybe take a period of time and go without sugar, or try without alcohol, or something that you really enjoy that maybe is taken maybe too much of a center of your life or taken up too much. It could be, for me, I went about 75 and a half days, I argue, because my wife went 76 days without meat. We did vegetarianism for that amount of time. But the thing about it is that period of time helped me to understand I didn't really need that to survive. Whereas before, as someone who values physical fitness, said, well, I need to eat this much protein, it has to be chicken, it has to be meat. And I was able to find it through alternative sources and change my diet. It was difficult at first, but it was helpful for me. Now, not everyone needs to go on a vegetarian kind of situation or just eating vegetables, but try eliminating something from your diet for a period of time that you're used to.
Yep, like even just something so simple as soda, right, out of your diet.
Common vice.
Oh my gosh. Watching some of the folks just that we work with, like they're big cups full of soda, and sometimes they go back for different cans, and it's just interesting to think like how often that is so simple into our diet. We don't even realize the ounces, the sugar, the other chemicals.
I want to offer a caution here, because we're talking about fasting, and usually that implies you essentially kind of quit things cold turkey. But I want to just bring up that people can be addicted, believe it or not, to these high amounts of sugar, especially caffeine that we regularly intake. And so if you cut yourself off from that all at once, you may literally experience withdrawal symptoms.
Yep.
Not just low energy, but probably crabbiness
Yep.
and
Some headaches.
a bit lower frustration tolerance. And so try to be mindful of that if you are going to go on a fasting. Maybe not cut it necessarily out all entirely at once. But there are a lot of really cool physiological benefits to fasting, especially since we're now talking about it, intermittent fasting when it comes to food. So the science behind this goes back to our Paleolithic days, and don't worry, I'm not going to get into some fad diets here. But the idea was that there were times when our ancestors didn't have a steady source of food. And they may, if you think back to the hunter-gatherer society, droughts, animal migration, things of that nature affected the food supply. And so they could go, days, sometimes even weeks without a steady supply of food. And so our bodies, from an evolutionary standpoint, just became adapted to ebbing and flowing when it comes to our food intake. And so it's actually not abnormal for us to go through intermittent fasting. In fact, it's something that our body physiologically is very well prepared for. Case in point, when we eat, our pancreas, beta cells in our pancreas produce insulin, and that's designed to help break down all the glucose that's coming in through the blood sugar, basically, that's coming in through our food sources. And that spikes initially after we eat, and then it starts to decline after a time. But if we don't have any more food after, say, a period of like 4 to 8 hours, then what starts to happen is our liver goes into something called glycolysis. Basically, our liver stores up a whole bunch of glucose that can then release into the bloodstream to provide us with additional energy throughout the day. So it's already like prepped and ready for us to go into a pseudo-starvation mode. Now, if let's say 24 hours goes by and we still haven't eaten anything else, then something called gluconeogenesis starts. And it's basically our body starting to produce glucose on its own. And where does it get this from? Our fat stores. And this can continue on for several more days without necessarily very detrimental effects to our body. Now, I will caveat this by saying our brain is one of the biggest consumers of energy resources in our body. In fact, I believe it's like 40% of our total energy stores are consumed by our brain. And that's because of so much that's happening. And so we need sugar, we need complex carbohydrates. I definitely don't recommend cutting those all out, but if you do decide to go into intermittent fasting, there are periods through which you can do this where it won't necessarily be detrimental and can actually be helpful in terms of insulin production and other hormonal effects in your body. There's a few different ways that people recommend doing this. One is the 16 to 8 hour rule. Have you heard of this, Chaplain?
Where you eat for 8 hours and 16 hours without eating.
Yeah. An easy way to do this is just skip breakfast in the morning. Maybe have water or coffee instead, and then you have a lunch and dinner. The important part of this, though, is not to change the normal caloric intake that you have at that lunch and dinner time. Some people will compensate by eating really big meals, right? And then you're basically canceling out the effects of it. So overall calorie intake does still matter here, especially if you're looking to lose weight. Or if you're trying to be more healthy in terms of the choices that you eat, that still plays a role as well. But another way to do this is the 5-2 rule. Have you heard of this before?
No.
No, so this is, instead of hours in the day, it's days of the week. So you basically pick 2 days, ideally not back to back, throughout the week where you don't eat. And then you have normal meals on the remaining 5 days. And that can produce some of the same positive effects of intermittent fasting as well. And I know some people have concerns when it comes to getting their electrolytes and micronutrients. I've seen several articles, and again, these are peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, one's from the Journal of Applied Physiology, that talk about how just taking a multivitamin can help you get the micronutrients you need in those intermittent fasting days. And maybe even on those fasting days, if you do the 5-2, you can have up to 500 calories and still be perfectly well off and not experience significant cognitive or other physical deficits, and still have roughly the same amount of energy that you would normally have throughout the day. The important part is to try to continue your routine as closely as you were before, and not try to compensate, either before or after with eating more or changing your physical activity.
That's really interesting. I'd never heard of that type of intermittent fasting, even the 8 to 16. That's very interesting. I think even our co-worker, doesn't she do something like that? Her stomach in the mornings are always like super growly, and she's like, I can't eat till 9:30, and I'm just like, girl, like, it gets crazy. But that makes more sense if she's doing something like that.
But she'll say she has more energy and can do
she
very
does.
well. Yeah,
she always reports feeling really good and needing less caffeine in the day. And
because again, you're inducing stress on a number of different levels of your physiology and your hormonal balances, but this is ultimately good because it causes adaptation. And so, if you're looking at doing something more long term, you can kind of experiment with which regulatory schedules work best for you. Some people, just given their activity throughout the day, or maybe their constraints when it comes to work or family life, maybe a 16-8 schedule is going to work better for them. For other people who maybe have a bit more flexibility, or maybe there's some days during the week where they just don't have time for food. Maybe a 5-2 is going to work better for them.
Well, we talked about a whole bunch of ways you can explore fasting today, whether it's intermittent fasting or fasting from electronics, or even maybe some people that might be maybe energy vampires taking some energy from you, or your phone or whatnot. But I challenge you just to try in this season where you're going to be surrounded by people who are fasting in different ways to try to give something up for a period of time. Maybe just give up your phone for half a day, or don't open social media for a week, or try something different for once. Please don't fast from podcasts though, especially this one. But whatever you'd like to do, just give it a go.
Yeah, and find something positive to replace it with. So if you're going to give up, let's say social media or electronics, for example, replace it with something that's engaging. Spending more time with friends or family, going for a walk, things of that nature. Something that's going to create added benefit for your life.
I definitely think one of the important parts too is if you are going to give up something, don't just power through it. Don't put your head down, just be like, I'm going to fast for whatever because this is the goal I've set. But take time to really think about, how do you feel with this fasting? Get a little insight into yourself. Why are you having such an adjustment issue? Or did you even realize you didn't have an adjustment issue at all? Like, it was fine giving whatever you gave up. Kind of develop a little insight into how you tick, because so often we don't pay attention to who we are or how we operate, and we just kind of go through our lives in like this really crazy sprint. And so, think about it.
This forces you to slow down. It's a great point.
Yeah, so you could find that maybe this thing that you gave up wasn't that big, important deal that you thought it was going to be, or conversely, maybe it was controlling a lot more of your life than you thought it was, and you find yourself literally withdrawing from that, and so it may cause you to reconsider how much of an impact you're allowing that to have on your day-to-day.
Definitely.
We want to thank you for listening to The Pillars, the podcast of the 363rd ISR Wing of the United States Air Force. I'm Chaplain Jim.
I'm Dr. Jair.
And I'm Sergeant Joe.
Until next time, we look forward to hearing you. Thank you for what you do, and just reach out to us in any way you'd like to. Bye.